It didn't happen on a stage. It didn't happen under flashing lights, or in front of screaming fans, or during one of those legendary Queen moments the world still replays like scripture. It happened in a quiet room, the kind of room where the truth has nowhere to hide. Late 1980s. London. Garden Lodge. Freddie Mercury had just come home after a long night. Not a party, not the glamorous chaos people like to imagine, but something colder. Something quieter. The kind of night that leaves you feeling watched even when you're alone. He was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. So he wandered through his own house like a ghost in velvet, passing expensive furniture that suddenly felt meaningless. Passing mirrors he avoided. Passing rooms full of things he had paid for, and people he wasn't sure he could trust. Then he heard it. A muffled voice behind a closed door. His name. At first, he thought he imagined it. Then he heard the other words, the ones that made his stomach drop and his blood turn cold. A laugh. A plan. A sentence spoken carelessly, like Freddie Mercury wasn't a person, but a resource. And in that moment, Freddie realized something that would change him permanently. Someone close to him wasn't loving him. They were using him. Who was it? What exactly did Freddie overhear that night? And why did he choose to smile afterward, pretending nothing was wrong, even as something inside him quietly broke? Stay with this story, because the truth behind Freddie Mercury's loneliness isn't just about fame. It's about betrayal that happens right in your own home. Garden Lodge was supposed to be safe. It wasn't just a house, it was the one place Freddie Mercury could retreat from the world without needing to perform. The high walls, the private garden, the quiet hallways, it all existed for one purpose, to keep noise out. But some nights, Freddie learned, silence didn't protect you. Some nights, silence made everything louder. He walked barefoot across the floor, the cold sensation grounding him as he moved through the dim hallway. A soft lamp glowed in the corner, casting warm light that should have felt comforting. It didn't. Freddie's mind was restless. Not creative restless, anxious restless. The kind that comes from realizing that fame doesn't just attract admiration. It attracts opportunists. People who learn how to speak your language just enough to sound sincere. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and didn't need. The glass clinked softly, the sound sharp in the quiet. From somewhere deeper in the house, he heard movement. A door opening. A footstep. A low voice. Freddie paused. Normally, it wouldn't have mattered. Garden Lodge often had people coming and going, assistants, friends, guests who stayed too late. Freddie was used to a revolving door of company, because emptiness was worse. But this sounded secretive. He moved slowly, almost silently, as if his own home had become unfamiliar territory. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was just tired. That paranoia was a side effect of too many years of being watched. Then he heard it again. His name. Not shouted. Not celebrated. Spoken in a tone that didn't belong in a house where love lived. Freddie stopped in front of a door that was slightly ajar. Light seeped out in a thin line across the floor. Voices murmured inside. He recognized one of them immediately. The other voice, he didn't catch at first. Freddie leaned in just enough to hear. A laugh. Then a sentence that made his chest tighten. He'll do it. He always does. You just have to push the right buttons. Freddie didn't breathe. His hand tightened around the glass. The voice continued, casual, amused, the kind of tone people use when they're confident they won't be caught. He hates conflict. If you frame it like it's for the band, or for the image, he'll agree. He wants to be loved too much to say no. Freddie felt the room tilt slightly, not physically, but emotionally. Like someone had pulled a curtain back on a play he didn't know he was in. Another voice responded, lower, cautious. Are you sure? The first voice chuckled again. Of course I'm sure. I've been around him long enough. He pretends he's hard, but he's soft where it counts. And soft people are easy. Freddie's stomach turned. Soft people are easy. He had heard worse things said about him in tabloids. He had survived public humiliation, mockery, headlines that tried to destroy him. But this wasn't a newspaper. This was inside his home. This was someone who had sat at his table. Someone who had laughed with him. Someone who had accepted his generosity, his trust, his private kindness, and now spoke about him like a machine you could operate if you knew where to press. Freddie stepped back quietly. His heart pounded. He wanted to fling the door open. He wanted to confront them with fury so sharp it would scorch the walls. He wanted to scream, "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know?" But his body didn't move. Not yet. Because the most devastating part wasn't anger. It was grief. The realization that he had been giving love, and someone had been calculating it. Freddie turned away slowly, walking back down the hallway with controlled steps. The drink in his hand shook slightly, the liquid rippling. He reached the end of the hall, stopped, and pressed his palm against the wall like he needed something solid. He stared into the darkness. And in that moment, Freddie Mercury, the man who could command an arena with a single look, felt something he couldn't sing his way out of. He felt used. And worse than that. He felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. Freddie didn't open the door. That choice would haunt him more than any argument ever could. Instead of bursting into the room, instead of demanding explanations, instead of letting anger explode the way people expected someone like him to react, Freddie did something far more dangerous. He stayed silent. He walked back to his bedroom slowly, each step measured, controlled, the way a performer walks back on stage after something goes wrong, refusing to let the audience see the damage. He closed the door behind him gently, leaned against it, and exhaled for the first time since hearing his name spoken like a strategy. Soft people are easy. The sentence replayed in his head with cruel precision. Freddie sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror across the room, mustache immaculate, posture composed, eyes darker than usual. He looked like Freddie Mercury. But inside, something fragile had cracked. He realized, sitting there in the quiet, that confrontation would give them power. It would tell them they had succeeded in reaching him. That they mattered enough to provoke him. And Freddie Mercury hated giving power away. So instead, he decided to watch. Over the next days, Freddie became a quieter version of himself, not withdrawn enough to raise suspicion, not expressive enough to feel genuine. He smiled. He joked. He hosted dinners. He played the role everyone expected. But now, he listened differently. He noticed how often requests were framed as favors for him, when they were clearly benefits for someone else. How decisions were presented as urgent, unavoidable, morally necessary, designed to corner him emotionally. "You'd understand if you cared about the band," someone said casually one afternoon. Freddie nodded. He understood perfectly. He began to see patterns. Compliments always preceded pressure. Praise softened him before the ask. Guilt was applied gently, like perfume, subtle, persistent. And what hurt most was how familiar the tactics felt. Because they worked. Freddie had spent his entire life negotiating love through performance. As a child, approval came when he was exceptional. As an adult, affection followed generosity, charisma, compliance. He had learned early that saying yes kept people close. Now, someone was exploiting that instinct. One evening, Freddie sat in the living room while voices filled the space around him. Laughter bounced off the walls. Music played softly in the background. To anyone watching, it looked like comfort. To Freddie, it felt like surveillance. He watched people carefully, how eyes lingered when he agreed to something, how relief spread when he didn't push back. He noticed who spoke for him when he didn't respond quickly enough. "He's fine with it," someone said once, without asking him. Freddie smiled faintly. "Yes," he thought. "I always am." That night, he poured himself another drink, untouched for long minutes. He stared at the surface, watching light fracture through the glass. "Why don't you say something?" The question echoed inside him. Because confrontation would force honesty, and honesty might confirm the worst fear he was trying not to name. That some people didn't love Freddie Mercury. They loved access. And if he stripped that away, what would be left? He tested it carefully. The next time a request came, carefully disguised as concern, Freddie hesitated. "I'll think about it," he said calmly. The reaction was immediate. Surprise. A flicker of irritation. Then recovery. "Of course," came the smooth reply. "Take your time." But the warmth had cooled. Freddie noticed. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Conversations grew shorter. Attention wandered elsewhere. Affection became conditional. The message was clear. Cooperate, or become inconvenient. That night, alone again, Freddie walked through Garden Lodge like a stranger revisiting a place he once knew. He ran his fingers along the walls, the furniture, the piano, all symbols of a life he had built. He stopped in front of the mirror once more. "How did I let this happen?" he whispered. The reflection didn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Freddie hadn't been naive. He had been hopeful. And hope, when misused, becomes a weapon. He sat down at the piano and pressed a single chord, low, unresolved, heavy. It lingered in the air, vibrating softly, like something waiting to be finished. Freddie rested his forehead against the cool wood. "I see you now," he said quietly, not to anyone in the room, but to the version of himself that had ignored warning signs in exchange for connection. He didn't know yet how this would end. But one thing was certain. Freddie Mercury would never hear the word love the same way again. Freddie kept saying yes. Not because he wanted to, but because saying no felt like detonating a bomb he wasn't ready to face. Every agreement came with a small internal fracture. Every concession chipped away at something private and essential. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Freddie was still charming, still magnetic, still the man people expected. Inside, he was shrinking. The requests didn't stop. They became more polished, more strategic. Always framed as urgent. Always wrapped in concern. "This is really important right now. You're the only one who can make this happen. It would look bad if you didn't support it." Freddie listened. Nodded. Agreed. And every time he did, he felt a quiet resentment rise, not just toward them, but toward himself. He began to dread conversations. Not confrontations, those he could handle. It was the subtle ones that exhausted him. The friendly tone masking pressure. The laughter disguising expectation. The assumption that he would bend, because he always had. At rehearsals, his patience wore thin. He snapped at small things, then apologized too quickly. Brian noticed the tension in his voice. Roger noticed the distance. John noticed the silences. "What's going on with you?" Roger asked one day, half joking. Freddie smiled tightly. "I'm evolving." It wasn't a lie. He was becoming someone harder. Sharper. Less willing to give freely, and angrier at himself when he still did. Late one night, alone again in Garden Lodge, Freddie stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. He studied his face, the mustache, the familiar angles, the confidence the world believed in. "Do they see me," he asked quietly, "or what I provide?" The question had no answer. He poured another drink and didn't touch it. He thought about the first time he'd felt genuinely loved, not admired, not celebrated, but wanted for who he was. The memory felt distant, almost fictional. Love, he was realizing, had become transactional in his world. And transactions always left someone empty. The next time a request came, Freddie tried something different. "I can't do that," he said calmly. The silence that followed was immediate and uncomfortable. Someone laughed awkwardly. "You're joking." "I'm not," Freddie replied. The mood shifted. Eyes exchanged glances. The warmth drained out of the room. Someone changed the subject too quickly, like smoothing over a crack before it widened. Freddie felt it, the withdrawal. Not anger. Not outrage. Disappointment. As if he had failed to play his part correctly. That night, he sat alone on the couch, lights low, music off. For once, he didn't try to distract himself. He let the discomfort sit. He realized something painful. He had trained people to expect access. And now, reclaiming himself felt like betrayal, not of them, but of the version of Freddie they preferred. The next days were worse. Invitations slowed. Conversations felt colder. People who once lingered in his presence now checked their watches. Compliments disappeared. Freddie noticed everything. And it confirmed what he feared most. Some people stayed only when he gave. That truth settled into his chest like a weight. One afternoon, he overheard another comment, softer this time, but no less revealing. "He's becoming difficult." Difficult. The word cut deeper than insult. Because it meant he was no longer useful in the way they wanted. Freddie laughed when he heard it. A short, bitter sound. For the first time, he understood that being easy had never protected him. It had only delayed the moment when people revealed who they really were. He returned to his bedroom and closed the door. The house felt larger than usual. Emptier. He sat on the bed and pressed his palms into his eyes. "I wanted to be loved," he whispered. "Not managed." The realization came slowly, painfully. He hadn't just been used by others. He had participated in it, because he was terrified of abandonment. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he made a quiet decision. If people were going to leave when he stopped giving, then maybe it was time to see who stayed. Distance has a way of telling the truth. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with ruthless clarity. Freddie didn't announce his withdrawal. He didn't explain himself. He simply stopped reaching first. Stopped filling silences. Stopped smoothing over discomfort with charm and generosity. And the effect was immediate. Phone calls slowed. Messages became shorter. Invitations arrived later, if they arrived at all. Conversations that once lingered now ended quickly, as if there was nothing left to extract. Freddie watched it happen with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness, because the pattern confirmed what he already knew. Relief, because uncertainty was worse than truth. He began spending more time alone at Garden Lodge. Not the performative solitude of exhaustion, but intentional quiet. Long mornings without plans. Afternoons spent walking through the garden, hands brushing against leaves, grounding himself in something real. In that stillness, memories surfaced. He thought about how often he had confused usefulness with love. How praise had always followed what he gave, never what he needed. How quickly affection cooled the moment he stopped being convenient. It was a brutal inventory. One evening, someone finally confronted him, not with concern, but irritation. "You've changed," the voice said, clipped. "You're not as available." Freddie tilted his head slightly. "Available?" "Yes." "You're distant. Hard to reach." Freddie smiled faintly. "That's interesting. I've been here the entire time." The other person didn't laugh. There was an awkward pause. "Well," they said finally, "people are starting to notice." Freddie nodded. "Good." The conversation ended shortly after. That night, Freddie sat at the piano, fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. He stared at the instrument like it was a witness, something that had seen him at his most honest and his most artificial. "I gave too much," he said aloud to the empty room. The words felt heavy, but true. As days passed, the divide grew clearer. Some people vanished completely. Others lingered awkwardly, unsure how to interact without the old dynamic. And then there were a few who surprised him. Brian stopped by unannounced one afternoon. No agenda. No request. "You've been quiet," Brian said, sitting across from him. Freddie studied him carefully. "Does that bother you?" Brian shrugged. "Only because I know you. And this feels different." Freddie exhaled slowly. "I'm tired of being useful." Brian didn't respond immediately. Then he nodded. "That makes sense. No pressure. No guilt. Just understanding." Freddie felt something loosen in his chest. Later that week, Roger sent a message, not asking for anything, just checking in. John dropped off notes from a rehearsal Freddie hadn't attended, with a simple line scribbled at the bottom. "Take your time." Those gestures mattered more than anyone realized. Because they weren't conditional. Still, the absence of others echoed louder. Freddie began to understand that what hurt wasn't being used. It was realizing how many people had only known how to love him when he was giving. One night, alone again, Freddie stood in front of the mirror and said something he had never allowed himself to admit. "I'm angry." The admission startled him. He wasn't angry at betrayal. He was angry at the years he had spent negotiating his worth. At the dinners hosted out of obligation. At the favors granted out of fear. At the silence he had maintained to keep peace. Peace, he was learning, was expensive. And he had been paying for it with himself. As the distance widened, clarity sharpened. Freddie no longer wondered who was using him. He saw it clearly. What he wondered now was something far more frightening. Who would remain once he stopped performing generosity? That question followed him into sleep, into waking, into moments of quiet reflection. And with it came a slow, irreversible shift. Freddie Mercury was no longer willing to disappear inside the version of himself that made others comfortable. Even if it meant standing alone. Freddie never confronted them. Not directly. Not with raised voices or dramatic exits. Instead, he confronted something far more difficult. Himself. The house grew quieter in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the exposed kind, the silence that leaves no room to hide from your own thoughts. Garden Lodge, once filled with movement and noise, now felt like a space waiting for honesty. Freddie spent more time alone in his bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed long after waking, staring at the light filtering through the curtains. He no longer rushed to fill the day. For the first time in years, he let time sit with him. And in that stillness, the truth surfaced. He had allowed people to use him because it made him feel necessary. Not admired. Not famous. Necessary. The realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. Freddie had spent his life being extraordinary, but extraordinary was exhausting. Being needed, on the other hand, felt grounding. It gave him purpose beyond performance. So when people leaned on him, financially, emotionally, strategically, he leaned back. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. One afternoon, he sat at the piano and played nothing. His fingers rested on the keys, unmoving, as if waiting for permission. "What are you afraid of?" he asked himself quietly. The answer came without resistance. Being alone. Not physically, Freddie was rarely alone in that sense. But emotionally abandoned. Unchosen. Unwanted when he wasn't dazzling or accommodating. He realized then that some people hadn't just used him. They had replaced love with access. And he had accepted it because the alternative terrified him. That night, Freddie poured himself a drink and finally took a sip. It burned slightly, not enough to numb, just enough to remind him he was still present. He stood in front of the mirror again, studying his reflection not as an icon, but as a man who had carried too much quietly. "I taught them how to treat me," he said softly. The words landed hard. Because they meant responsibility. Not blame, but agency. And agency meant change. Freddie began setting boundaries that no one noticed at first. Small ones. Almost invisible. He declined invitations without explanation. He stopped offering help before being asked. He allowed silence to exist in conversations without rushing to rescue it. Some people reacted poorly. Others drifted away without a word. A few stayed. And that difference told him everything. One evening, Jim found Freddie sitting alone in the living room, lights low, the city humming faintly beyond the windows. "You're different lately," Jim said gently. Freddie smiled faintly. "I'm trying to be honest." "With who?" Jim asked. "With myself," Freddie replied. Jim sat beside him. "That's usually the hardest one." Freddie nodded. "I didn't want to admit that I was trading myself for company." Jim said nothing, but his presence was enough. For the first time, Freddie didn't feel the urge to perform gratitude or charm. He simply existed. And that was new. Later, lying awake, Freddie thought about the moment he had overheard the conversation that started all of this. The casual cruelty. The confidence with which someone had spoken about him like a tool. Strangely, the memory no longer made him angry. It made him clear. He understood now that confrontation wouldn't have fixed anything. Exposure wouldn't have healed him. What mattered was no longer allowing access to replace affection. He had been used. Yes. But he had also survived. And survival, Freddie was learning, didn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looked like restraint. Sometimes it looked like silence. Sometimes it looked like choosing yourself, even when it meant fewer people in the room. Freddie closed his eyes and took a slow breath. For the first time, the thought of being alone didn't terrify him quite as much. Because he was no longer abandoning himself to keep others close. The change wasn't dramatic. No announcement. No confrontation. No slammed doors. Freddie Mercury simply stopped smiling for people who hadn't earned it. It happened gradually, so subtly that most didn't notice at first. He still attended gatherings. Still spoke kindly. Still showed up when it mattered. But something essential had shifted. The smile that once came easily, automatic, generous, disarming, was now selective. And that made people uncomfortable. Freddie felt it immediately. The way conversation stalled when he didn't fill the space. The way jokes fell flat when he didn't rescue them with charm. The way some people leaned in closer, uncertain, as if trying to locate the version of him they were used to. He didn't help them. For the first time, Freddie allowed people to sit with their discomfort. At rehearsals, he was quieter, not distant, but present in a different way. He spoke when it mattered. He listened more than he entertained. Brian noticed it first. "You don't seem like you're trying anymore," Brian said one afternoon, half smiling. Freddie raised an eyebrow. "Trying to what?" "Be everything," Brian finished. Freddie considered that. "Good," he said softly. That word carried more weight than anyone realized. Because for years, Freddie had believed that being everything was the price of belonging. Now, he understood the cost. One evening, back at Garden Lodge, Freddie stood alone in the living room, looking out into the garden. The lights outside were dim, the world quiet. He felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Peace. Not happiness, peace. The absence of tension. The absence of negotiation. The absence of self-abandonment. He thought about the people who had faded away once he stopped giving freely. About how quickly affection had cooled when access disappeared. It hurt. But not in the way he expected. It hurt like clarity. Freddie realized that he hadn't lost love. He had lost transactions disguised as affection. That distinction changed everything. Later that night, he caught his reflection in the glass, not posing, not performing, just existing. The man staring back at him looked tired, yes. Worn. Changed. But he also looked intact. "I don't owe anyone my softness," Freddie whispered. The sentence felt radical. Because softness had always been the doorway through which people entered his life, and sometimes, the way they took pieces of him without asking. From that day forward, Freddie chose where to place it. Not everywhere. Not for everyone. Only where it was safe. Some people called him colder. Others said he had become distant. A few accused him of arrogance. Freddie didn't argue. Because he finally understood something he had spent years avoiding. You don't owe access to people who confuse generosity with entitlement. And you don't have to bleed to be loved. Weeks later, someone who had once spoken about him as a resource tried to reconnect, casual, friendly, as if nothing had happened. Freddie listened politely. Then he declined, calmly. The conversation ended quickly. Freddie felt no triumph. Just relief. That night, lying in bed, he thought about how long it had taken him to learn this lesson, how many years of smiling, giving, absorbing discomfort in silence. He wished, briefly, that he had learned it sooner. Then he let the thought go. Because regret, like manipulation, belonged to the past. Freddie Mercury would still give. Still care. Still love deeply. But never again at the expense of himself. And that, quiet, uncelebrated, unseen, was one of the bravest things he ever did.